unexpected request to introduce Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He walked to the podium at a fundraiser at the Anaheim Disneyland Hotel. Marlon Brando had organized the event for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King wanted to make the case for massive direct action in Washington, D.C. on behalf of America's poor, but found that many who once supported his desegregation efforts in the South were less than enthusiastic about his agenda around jobs and poverty. Desegregating lunch counters didn't cost much. Ending poverty would cost the nation billions of dollars, and sentimentality alone could not pay the bill. The Los Angeles Times reported that King had, quote, found that some of the white groups he was counting on for support have held back for fear his campaign would turn to chaos. The idea of occupying the nation's capital with poor people scared the hell out of some, even on the board of SCLC. For others, like Mayor Rustin, a trusted advisor of Dr. King since the days of the Montgomery bus boycott, such an act of civil disobedience courted violence and threatened to deepen the so-called white backlash against the civil rights agenda. Rustin wanted the membership of SCLC to focus on electing Democrats to political office, not on building a tent city or blocking bridges or staging sit-ins at congressional offices. Nevertheless, Dr. King persisted and needed the support. Jimmy approached the podium and announced in a somewhat halting manner his surprise at being asked to introduce Dr. King, and then launched into an abbreviated account of how they had arrived at this moment in 1968. He did not say much, if anything, about Dr. King, only that, quote-unquote, Martin had spent most of his time in the early years of the movement in and out of jail trying to redeem what we claim we live by. Instead, Baldwin told a brief story about the promise of those early days and the country's ongoing refusal to change. His was an effort to jog the memory and, by extension, the moral conscience of the audience. Quote, what Rosa Parks was saying in 1956 in Montgomery, and what the Negroes were saying in their march for 381 days, Baldwin told. The country did not want to hear or did not hear. Once again, he invoked the quick passage of time between the beginning of the movement, the volatility of 1968, and the ugliness and sorrow that happened in between. Quote, as time rolled on, kids, including people like Stokely Carmichael, were being beaten with chains, going to jail, marching up and down those dusty highways, trying to change the conscience of this country. Still nobody heard and nobody cared, end quote. Baldwin's introduction of Dr. King was all about America's betrayal, about the wall of white supremacy that clearly stood in the way of fundamental transformation in the country, and about the extraordinary urgency they all faced at what was fast becoming the crossroads. Now, Dr. King did not acknowledge Jimmy in his speech. He simply offered generic thanks to all of those who spoke before him, yet the substance of King's remarks that night echoed Baldwin's account of the country's betrayal. King didn't mince words. America was a decidedly racist country, he said. Quote, the problem can only be solved when there's a kind of coalition of conscience, he said. Now, I'm not sure if we have that many consciences left. Too many have gone to sleep, but there are some left, and we gotta be that creative minority ready to do battle for the sacred issues of life, ready to do battle for the principles of justice, goodwill, and brotherhood, quote, end quote, he said. But like Baldwin, King struggled with the reality of white America's commitment to the belief that white people mattered more than others. Throughout the speech, he argued the merits of the Poor People's Campaign. He talked about the dire poverty of the country. Quote, I've seen the rats and I've seen the roaches. King spoke about the immorality of the Vietnam War, but in the end, he understood the nature of the challenge to his faith in the country's commitment to freedom. Quote, I must honestly confess that I go through moments of disappointment when I have to recognize that there aren't enough white people in our country who are willing to cherish democratic principles over privilege. But I'm grateful to God that there are some left. King had hit his own wall and desperately sought to find his footing. Once lauded as one of the most respected men in the world, he now found himself in 1968 persona non grata as the nation turned its back on his moral vision. His position on the Vietnam War led some to call him a traitor. The New York Review of Books declared that he was, quote, that he has been outstripped by the times, end quote. And even one young black woman went as far as to call him a sellout. As King brought his speech to a close, he tried to reach for the promise of America. Quote, I believe we are going to get there, that is freedom, because however much he strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom, end quote. But his somber tone and the sadness in his eyes betrayed those hopeful words. Baldwin had noticed something different in Dr. King. He seemed, quote, 5 years wearier and 5 years sadder, end quote. The demands of his leadership in the face of renewed white resistance, the shifts in the political climate around Vietnam, the riots in the street, the militancy of black power, along with its rejection of nonviolence, took a toll on his spirit. Gwendolyn Green, who helped him arrange his appearances in Los Angeles, said she saw a visible change in him. Quote, he was dark, gaunt, and tired. He felt that his time was up, end quote. All the people around Dr. King, staff and family, knew something was terribly wrong, and his speech that night reflected the turmoil, the depression, and the disillusionment of his last days. Baldwin and King had been together just a few weeks earlier at a Carnegie Hall event in New York City, celebrating the 100th birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual and co-founder of the NAACP. Du Bois, after 7 decades of fighting for racial justice in the United States, had given up on America and died in exile in Accra, Ghana, on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963. But on this evening, February 23rd, 1968, an extraordinary gathering of scholars, entertainers, and activists celebrated his life. Baldwin chose to read his piece, Black Power. And like he did in The Fire Next Time with his account of the Nation of Islam, he sought to render intelligible the anger of Carmichael and those like him. King disagreed with the rhetoric and symbolism of Black Power. He offered the example of Du Bois as a counter. Quote, Du Bois exemplified Black power in achievement, and he organized Black power in action. It was no abstract slogan to him, end quote. But even then, King's remarks were shadowed by despair. Quote, Negroes have heavy tasks today. We were partially liberated and then re-enslaved. We have to fight again on old battlefields, end quote. Before he was killed at the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968, Jimmy and King would be together one last time for a fundraiser in New York City. Baldwin didn't have a dark suit for the occasion, so he ran out to purchase one and had it fitted. Quote, 2 weeks later, as Baldwin recalled in No Name in the Street, I wore this same suit to Martin's funeral. Baldwin had returned to California now. He found out about King's murder while working on the screenplay about Malcolm X and navigating what had become a disastrous relationship with Columbia Pictures. Jimmy wrote the screenplay that Spike Lee eventually produced. Can you imagine they wanted Charlton Heston to play Malcolm? Well, hey, they wanted Julia Roberts to play Harry. The film, as Baldwin imagined, would not get done, so he was sitting by his swimming pool with Billy D. Williams at his rented home in Palm Springs when the phone rang. Baldwin picked it up. Jimmy, Martin's just been shot. He's not dead yet, but it's a head wound. So, Baldwin dropped the phone and wept. There is an intimate grief here that cannot be glossed over with some abstract idea of the loss of a leader. In a way, Baldwin and King, no matter the temperamental difference between them, moved together as they struggled to make real the promise of American democracy. King was the preacher and Baldwin was the poet. Billy D. Williams said that Martin's death was with Jimmy for a long time. I doubt if he ever got over it. Much of his hope died with King. Something in him, much more than his voice, broke on April 4th, 1968. Baldwin was not naive about the human capacity for evil, especially among white folk. He knew intimately what it meant to be vulnerable to the whims of others who held a certain kind of power over you. Quote, if you're a Negro, you're in the center of that peculiar affliction, he said. Because anybody can touch you when the sun goes down. You know you're the target of everybody's fantasies. He didn't need King's murder to learn that lesson. It was the fact that they killed someone who espoused love, who was an apostle of nonviolence. King's death revealed the depths of their debasement. Baldwin wrote of King's murder and the funeral, quote, since Martin's death in Memphis and that tremendous day in Atlanta, something has altered in me. Something has gone away, perhaps even more than the death itself. The manner of his death has forced me into a judgment concerning human life and human beings, which I have always been reluctant to make. Incontestably, alas, most people are not in action worth very much. And yet every human being is an unprecedented miracle. One tries to treat them as the miracles they are while trying to protect oneself against the disasters they've become. Baldwin struggled to come to terms with the meaning of King's death, what his murder said about the country, about white people, about human beings in general. But perhaps more importantly, he struggled to come to terms with the meaning of King's living witness. My own mind, after I left Atlanta, he wrote, began to move backward in time to places, people, and events I thought I had forgotten. Sorrow drove me there. And I think sorrow and a certain kind of bewilderment, end quote. Y'all all right? I just want to check.
Yeah.
Good? I'm trying to get someplace. Baldwin sought to tell a story of the confusion and the mourning of loss. Past and fragmented memories became not so much a place of refuge, but ruins and rubble filled with bodies and broken promises ready to escalate. After King's murder, he had to gather up the pieces, not only of himself, but of black folk buried beneath the ongoing disaster that was the country. The disasters never stopped. King's death, just like Medgar's death, just like Malcolm's death, and all the others, did not stop time. Time kept moving. White people didn't stop being white people. Baldwin and Black America had to mourn and make sense of unimaginable loss with little time to do so because the nastiness of the world kept coming. Here, intimate grief morphs into blocked grief. King's murder ripped the fabric of common concern and was the latest, perhaps the most visibly painful example of the dead piling up right in front of black people. Stokely Carmichael put the grief succinctly. Quote, when America killed Dr. King last night, she declared war on us.
Amen.
Little time to mourn, then we carried our dead forward in our resentments and our unresolved questions. All of which gave black politics, it certainly gave Baldwin's voice a bit of an edge. It was and remains the bitterness at the bottom of the cup. How could white America be shocked when some 125 cities exploded in violence after King's death? They're always clutching their pearls. It often feels like, at least to me, we are expected to suffer our dead in silence. Y'all hear me? That death's inevitability for us goes beyond the mere fact that we are human beings, that the cost of eating the apple in the Garden of Eden wasn't enough for us. Instead, death constantly shadows black lives in this country, and we're expected, it feels like it is assumed, to accept that fate, that fact like dogs' fate to be put down. What would it mean to recall King's life in the context of the unimaginable act of his murder? Death rewrites the earlier moments of King's life and reorients us as we take in the story, no matter how fragmented and pained it is, and witness Dr. King's sacrifice. We are changed as we walk through the stations of this particular cross-bearing human being. In this sense, Baldwin had to tell what he witnessed, what he felt in his bones, our salvation, he believed, depended on. Some 7 years earlier, in an article for Harper's Magazine entitled "The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King," and I should have said earlier that the title of this talk is "The Dangerous Road Before Us." The dangerous road before Martin Luther King. Baldwin had already noted the difference in King's voice from the heady days of the Montgomery bus boycott. This is 61. Quote, King was more beleaguered than he had ever been before, and not only by his enemies in the white South, he did not look any older, and yet there was a new note of anguish in his voice, end quote. King's life telescoped the manic pace of the Black freedom movement and foreshadowed the after times with its block grief. What does it mean to try to pick up the pieces in a moment when the country has betrayed its ideals once? Well, remember King is grappling with this, Doc. Remember what he said. I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. The Harper's piece was written in 61, and Baldwin, like a Hebrew prophet, had already spied the significant changes on the horizon. The radicalism of King's new courageous witness now stood alongside the actions of a growing student movement made up of young people who, quote, never believed in the American image of the Negro and who have never bargained with the Republic and they never will, end quote. Both would challenge traditional models of Black leadership predicated on the old racial status quo. Both set the stage for the liberation of all Americans from what Baldwin called the racial anguish that disfigured our national soul and required of us a new creation. But, quote, the battle to achieve this has not ended. It has scarcely begun, Baldwin wrote in 1961. Listen at this language. King is entirely right, Baldwin, when he says that segregation is dead. The real question which faces the Republic is just how long, how violent, and how expensive the funeral is going to be. Oh. Woo. And this question, it is up to the Republic to resolve. It is not in King's hands. Well, the Republic answered with the rifle shot to King's head. 2 days after his death, 18-year-old Bobby Hutton of the Black Panther Party was killed by the Oakland Police Department. Robert Kennedy was murdered 2 months later. Cities burned throughout the country. The Tet Offensive revealed the brutal carnage and senselessness of the war. Police rioted in Chicago at the Democratic Convention. The country lurched to the right with the election of Richard Nixon, who exploited white America's fears and insisted, quote, that minorities were undercutting America's greatness, end quote. Ronald Reagan would show up and say, let's make America great. I'm trying to get somewhere.
Go ahead, sir.
The dangerous road before Martin Luther King Jr. went beyond the immediate threats of racism. James Earl Ray, King's murderer, was a serious problem, but he wasn't the core of the problem. Identifying loud racist and condemning them is the easy part, and that condemnation often lends itself to a kind of sentimentality that masks cruelty. What Baldwin referred to as the dangerous road before Dr. King was whether or not the country could muster the courage to confront its demons and transform itself into a genuine democracy as Dr. King demanded. Could America tell itself the truth about how we arrived at this moment? Could it tell itself the truth about its past and its present? Did it have the moral stamina to do the work required to surrender the comfort of our national myths and illusions? And if we failed, what would be the cost? We certainly have to be attuned to the darker dimensions of the American story. But we need to approach the past that sees through the legend. We need an approach to the past that sees through the legend and forces us to confront how our practices disfigure the ideal of democracy itself. Our turn to the past must be much more than just a litany of the evils of men. We have to expose our pretended virtue in order to make room for a different way of being in the world. As Baldwin put it, we must always be mindful of the miracles that we are and the disasters that we've become. And our task as witnesses is to open up space for us to begin again. But that's hard work. Almost Sisyphean-like labor in a country so wedded to its legends and so in need of its illusions. Black folk have sacrificed generations and martyrs like Dr. King trying to fight it all. And here we are in the second decade of the 21st century with the ugliness of Trumpism still fighting for an understanding of American history that will finally set white folk free.
Amen.
At every turn, the country fails to transform. At the moment in which we give voice to the principles of liberty and freedom with the American Revolution, we reconcile it with the institution of slavery. The Civil War, over the context of the issue of slavery, introduces modern warfare in the world of carnage the world has never seen, and out of it comes radical reconstruction, an attempt to build a genuine multiracial democracy. What do we get in response? We get convict leasing, another form of slavery and Jim Crow, betrayal. The mid-20th century, everyday ordinary black folk dared to put their bodies on the line just to get entree into the American project. And what do we get in response to King's call for nonviolence? We get his murder, and then we get calls for law and order. We get the tax revolt in California. They elect Barack Obama, the first black president in the United States. And what do we get in response? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party. We get voter ID laws and voter suppression, and then we vomit at Donald Trump. It's a Sisyphean-like labor.
Tell it.
How do we muster the strength to look through the sadness and the despair and the disillusionment to push this rock up the hill? Let me get back to my text. I'm coming on.
Come on.
In July of 1968, just 3 months after Dr. King's assassination, and against the backdrop of American cities burning, Esquire magazine interviewed James Baldwin. He set the tone of the interview, Doc, with his answers to the first two questions. The interviewer asked him, how can we get the black people to cool? Baldwin said, it is not for us to cool. And then the questioner asked, but aren't you the ones who are getting hurt the most? And Jimmy said, no, we're only the ones who are dying the fastest. The interviewer didn't get the point. He did not see how the moral burden of America's racial nightmare rested not with the black people rioting in the streets, but with those white people. And they were not all like loud racists who insisted on holding so tightly to the belief that they were somehow, because of the color of their skin, better than others, those others who were not white. These people had to see themselves otherwise. Passing new laws or declarations of unending sympathy or acts of racial charity would never be enough to change the course of the country. The path had been set with the initial lie. The path of the country had been set with the initial lie. That lie that black people were somehow less than human beings, and that lie enabled the country to reconcile the principles of democracy with the ugliness of racial slavery. Something more radical had to be done. So in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued, among other things, that white supremacy stood in the way of democracy in this country, that it was an ever-present force in America, frustrating the dreams of the nation's darkest citizens and undermining any pretense to racial justice. He wrote, quote, "Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says. And they have taken white Americans at their word when they talk of it as an objective. But most whites in America," this is King now, "proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but it must, in most respects, to retain it." End quote. King is saying here that for most white Americans, there's a distinction to be made, because to be white is a moral identity. We have to make a distinction between those people. I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and they're white folks. You understand the distinction?
Amen.
Right? But here, King is trying to say that those who are invested in a particular understanding of whiteness view equality as a philanthropic enterprise. As charity. Something that they possess that they can give to others. King did not draw this conclusion from some abstract set of ideological principles. Instead, his was a conclusion drawn from the intense experience of challenging racial segregation in the South and of confronting a nation that, no matter its stated commitments to democracy, supported the underlying beliefs which sustained that form of life. Dr. King came to understand, and this is often obscure in how we remember him, the depths of American racism. He had underestimated how deeply rooted white supremacy was in the habits of American life. How the transformation of the heart he had so eloquently preached about since the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott required a fundamental change in the practices and structures of the country, in the stories we told ourselves. Change that could not depend solely on the moral conscience of white people, no matter our willingness to sacrifice and suffer. In fact, in August of 1967, Dr. King stated plainly, the vast majority of white Americans are racist, either consciously or unconsciously. End quote. This commitment to the idea that white people were superior to others distorted the principles of democracy and disfigured the moral character of those who believed. King had seen it up close in the contorted faces of sheriffs in small southern towns and in the ferocity of young white toughs in Cicero, Illinois. He remained committed, however, throughout to the moral power of his call to the nation, but he now understood that something far greater was required if America was to be redeemed. Dr. King's moral call to the nation required more than desegregating lunch counters or the creation of a vibrant black middle class or electing a black president. There had to be a transformation of the national soul. The old America had to die so that a new nation could be born. By 1968, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Memphis, that vision appeared to be a pipe dream. Baldwin and Dr. King had witnessed the violent resistance among white Americans to substantive racial equality, and they saw the unbridled rage among black people whose hopes were dashed once again. At a 1967 SCLC retreat in Frogmore, South Carolina, King outlined his stakes, quote, "The movement for social change has entered a time of temptation, of despair. Because it is clear now how deep and how systemic are the evils it confronts." And the fog of the Vietnam War had deepened the malaise. I'm coming home. I'm coming.
Come on.
King wrote as he was vilified for his opposition to the war that never before had the, quote, "the right to question or foreign policy had been so severely thwarted," end quote. He saw dead Vietnamese babies and mangled bodies. He saw broken men return home. He saw a nation whose soul was truly in need. King said, if America's soul becomes truly poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam.
Yes, sir.
He was right. The movement had entered a time of despair, and that despair would deepen with this murder on April 4th, 1968. And here we are today, living in the shadows of the disaster that is Trumpism, and grappling with our own temptation of despair. They doubled down on the lie again. They betrayed the principles again. The drumbeat of war is deafening. And we find ourselves here at home in a cold civil war. We have those who are desperately holding on to a vision of the United States that no longer makes sense, and those who are fighting for the birth of a different America, while white liberals are running around here patting themselves on the back because they hate Donald Trump. But the divisions, Donna, the divisions in the country feel old and worn, like we've been here before. And in so many ways, today feels like we are fighting not so much old battles, but old ghosts that continue to haunt. The hates of the past has the country by the throat. You see, I'm country, I said hates. We got the country by the throat. And the dangerous road before Martin Luther King, Baldwin wrote that we are witnessing the death of segregation as we knew it. And the question was how long and how expensive would the funeral be? Would the funeral be? If only he knew we are still in that funeral procession. We are still grappling with the form of history which keeps us from seeing the human beings right in front of our faces. To be sure, a world is dying, but we have been slow walking to put it in the grave. And the costs are mounting. What does it mean to grapple with King's sadness? What does it mean to grapple with King's disillusionment? What does it mean to grapple with King's despair? Don't run to Easter Sunday. Rest in Saturday for a moment. How does one find one's faith in that moment when it seems that all is so dark and dim? How do we muster the courage to push the rock up the hill again? What have been the cost? How many of our children are languishing in failing schools? How many of our loved ones are rotting in prisons and jails? How many are breaking their backs trying to make ends meet, only to fall deeper and deeper into holes full of economic quicksand? How many have we put in the ground? And how many souls have been darkened because of the corrosive effects of America's original sin?
Wow.
What have been the cost of this long journey? Something has died. But the ghost will not leave us alone. True freedom. And this is how I read Dr. King in those later days. True freedom for all Americans requires that we confront the ghost directly. Maybe tell a different story. A better story about how we arrived at this moment. Stop dancing with white folks. Tell them the truth. Stop playing it safe. Take risks in this moment of darkness. Stand on your faith. And challenge those whom you love and those who you will extend love to be otherwise. And tell those ghosts to go on now.
Yes, sir.
And rest. We got this. All of which requires that we work even harder for a better world. That we work even harder for the beloved community. That we put aside the old fears in order to kill that creation of the old order. To bury that old Negro and the white people who so desperately needed him. And be reborn. Yet something, I'm not sure what it is. Yes, something, I'm not sure what it is trying to be reborn. But it's up to us to be midwives.
Amen.